Techniques, Historical Development, from the Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. Christianity and Technique. The East, passive, fatalist, contemptuous of life and action. The West, active, conquering, turning nature to profit. These contrasts, so dear to popular sociology, are said to result from a difference in religion, Buddhism and Islam on the one hand, on the other Christianity, which is credited with having forged the practical soul of the West. These ideas are hardly beyond the level of the rote repetitions found even in the works of serious historians. It is not for me to examine religious doctrines in themselves or as absolute if unrealized dogma, but rather to interpret them sociologically. After all, I am not writing theology. I am writing history. And there is a world of difference between dogma and its sociological application. I shall not touch upon the personal interpretation of religion, which concerns the relationship between the individual and God. This being the case, it is obvious that certain statements call for modification. For example, the assertion that, as a consequence of the teachings of Muhammad, the Islamic conquests of the 7th century are evidence of passivism. This might also be said of the determined Islamic resistance to Western encroachments during the last 2 centuries. We attribute to Buddhist indifferentism the remarkable artistic, political, and military development in India from the 2nd to the 5th century. In fact, however, these civilizations were little advanced technically, though they had developed in many other areas. Christianity in Russia, on the other hand, gave rise to a mystical civilization which was indifferent to material life and had no technical drive and no interest in economic exploitation. Ah, yes, is the reply, but Christianity in Russia had Eastern overtones. Here, then, indifference to technique would appear to be a question of temperament and not of religion. Another embarrassing fact. When in her decline Greece applied herself to technical inquiry and the development of industry, she looked to the East for methods. And in the 1st century, when Rome, the perfect example of the technical spirit in antiquity, took up industry, she too turned to the East for industrial techniques, the refining of silver and gold, glass-making, the tempering of weapons, pottery, ship construction, and so on. All these techniques came to Rome from the East, either early, through the Etruscans, or much later, after the conquests. We are far indeed from being able to support this traditional cleavage between East and West. In fact, during classical antiquity it was the East which possessed the concrete, inventive mind that grasps the truth and exploits it. The West is making a prodigious advance in technique at the present, and the West is traditionally Christian. Nor can it be maintained that Christianity is a negligible factor in that advance. However, there were several distinct historical periods in the West. The West was officially Christian until the 14th century. Thereafter, Christianity became controversial and was breached by other influences. What do we find, from a technical standpoint, in the so-called Christian era, the period from the 4th to the 14th centuries, the sociological moment? First, we observe the breakdown of Roman technique in every area, on the level of organization, as well as in the construction of cities, in industry, and in transport. From the 4th to the 10th centuries, in fact, there was a complete obliteration of technique, a condition so deplored that it became a focus of anti-Christian polemic, and rightly so. It was because the Christians held judicial and other technical activity in such contempt that they were considered the enemies of the human race, and not only because they opposed Caesar. The reproach of Celsus was not without truth. After the Christian triumph in Rome, there was not one great jurist left who could guarantee the life and the value of the Roman organization. Decadence? No. Complete disinterest in such activity. St. Augustine devoted much of his De Civitate Dei to justifying the Christians in this respect, and to denying that their influence was detrimental. They are good citizens, he proclaimed. That may have been so, but their focus of interest was nevertheless on something other than the state and practical activity. I shall show later on that the technical state of mind is one of the principal causes of technical progress. It is not a coincidence that Rome declined as Christianity triumphed. The Emperor Julian was certainly justified in accusing the Christians of ruining the industry of the empire. After this period of decadence, for which, of course, Christianity was not solely responsible, what does the historian find? The restoration, under Christian influence, of an active civilization, methodical, exploiting the riches of the world as a gift given by God to be put to good use? Not at all. The society which developed from the 10th to the 14th century was vital, coherent, and unanimous, but it was characterized by a total absence of the technical will. It was a-capitalistic as well as a-technical. From the point of view of organization, it was an anarchy in the etymological sense of the word, and it was completely non-technical. Its law was principally based on custom. It had no social or political organization based on reasoned, elaborated rules. In all other areas, for example in agriculture and industry, there was the same nearly total absence of technique. This was also true with regard to the military, the principal activity of the time. Combat was reduced to its most elementary, to charging in a straight line, and to hand-to-hand engagement. Only architectural technique developed and asserted itself, but this was prompted not by a technical state of mind, but by religious impulse. Little effort was made to improve agricultural or industrial practices. There was no effort at useful creation, evidence of the remarkable practical genius of the Christian religion. And when, at the beginning of the 12th century, at first very feebly a technical movement began to take form, it developed under the influence of the East. The technical impetus of our civilization came from the East, at first through the intermediacy of the Judei, footnote, a particular kind of trader, and the Venetians, and later through the Crusades. But even so, it limited itself to imitating what it had seen, except in art. Certain autonomous discoveries did take place, especially as a result of commercial necessity, but this development was no more intense than it had been under the Roman Empire. In fact, the Middle Ages created only one new, complete technique, and an intellectual technique, a mode of reasoning, scholasticism. The very name evokes its mediocrity. With its gigantic apparatus, it was in the end nothing but an extremely cumbersome formalism. It wandered for centuries in intellectual blind alleys, notwithstanding the prodigious intellects of the men who used it, and were deformed by it. The balance sheet shows no triumphs, even on the historical plane. The technical movement of the West developed in a world which had already withdrawn from the dominant influence of Christianity. A point can doubtless be made of the effects of the Reformation, but the economic consequences of this movement have been singularly exaggerated. In any case, this is not the place to take up this question. Although practically speaking it seems clear that Christianity was scarcely an important cause of technical progress, not to mention regression, it is nevertheless customary to hold that Christianity, from the theological point of view, paved the way for technical development. Let us consider the two arguments advanced for this point of view. First, and most important, it is held that Christianity suppressed slavery, the great obstacle to technical development. The moment men are free, they supposedly turn toward technique to be delivered from the misery of labor. Slavery was thus a hindrance to technique because no attempt was made either to relieve the miserable condition of the slave or to replace him by some other motive force. The second argument is more intelligent, that antiquity was possessed of a holy fear of nature, and dared not lay hand on the secrets which, to the ancients, were gods. They dared not make use of natural forces, which, for them, were supernatural. Christianity secularized nature. With Christianity, nature once again became simply nature, and no one scrupled to exploit it. Unfortunately, however, neither of these arguments is quite accurate. There was, in fact, greater technical progress in civilizations where slavery was prevalent, for example, Egypt, than in others where that institution was practically unknown, for example, Israel. There was greater technical progress in the slaveholding period of Roman history than in the period when slaves were freed wholesale, and the liberation of the slaves during the era of the barbarian invasions produced no technical improvement, even at long term. Almost 7 centuries elapsed between the suppression of slavery and the beginning of even a feeble technical advance. The relation between technique and the absence of slavery is in no sense absolute. As Bertrand Gilles has rightly pointed out, human transport by means of slaves was not known in Roman antiquity. yet the harnessing of animals had not been developed. We have here one of those facile, impressive, and altogether anti-historical explanations which theorists are so fond of. The slave, in fact, represented capital which it was not in the owner's interest to lose or to use haphazardly. And, as the elder Cato indicates, had it been possible to make the slave's labor more efficient and less fatiguing, his master had every interest in doing so. Moreover, it did not cost anything to make use of the free men who lived on the vast domains of the public treasury, or the limes, or the marches. Footnote: the limes designated the empire's boundary regions to the north, the marches the Scottish and Welsh border areas, and, later, on the ecclesiastical and seigneurial lands. Certainly, it was not respect for human life which prompted the Romans to spare these people, and the people themselves scarcely possessed the freedom of mind or the material possibilities to improve their techniques. Gilles has shown admirably that, in Athens, the Greek slaves may have had greater value than the free workmen. The second argument is no more applicable. It is true that Christianity secularized nature, but did this benefit technique? We have noted in passing the religious origin of many forms of technique. Indeed, nature, as the theater of spiritual forces, gives rise to one particular technique already mentioned: magic. One of the goals of magic is to render the gods propitious to practical action, and to put the powers at the service of material technique. The representation of nature as inhabited by the gods was itself a potent act, and favorable, if not to all applications, certainly to technique itself. Taboos applied only to certain concrete applications which were determined by ideas of right and wrong. Man thus felt that his actions were justified by the help given him by the gods of nature. Christianity, however, deprived him of this justification. What was the doctrinal position of early Christianity regarding practical activity from the very beginning? On the moral plane, Christianity condemned luxury and money, in short, everything that represented the earthly city, which was consecrated to Satan and opposed to the city of God. This was the era of the anchorite, of the renunciation of city life, of cenobitism presented as an ideal. The tendency was toward the restriction of economic life. On the theological plane, there was the conviction that the world was approaching its end, that it was useless to strive to develop or cultivate it, for the Lord was soon to return. It was wiser to be concerned with eschatology than with worldly affairs. At the beginning of the medieval period, these doctrines lost some of their hold, although they persisted under other guises, the feeling about death, for instance. But another element of Christianity remained which was opposed to technical development, the moral judgment which Christians passed on all human activities. Technical activity did not escape Christian moral judgment. The question, is it righteous, was asked of every attempt to change modes of production or of organization. That something might be useful or profitable to men did not make it right and just. It had to fit a precise conception of justice before God. When an element of technique appeared to be righteous from every point of view, it was adopted, but even then with excessive caution. Only inventions, representing a choice among techniques made by individuals versed in Greek or Latin, judged worthy, were applied or even allowed to become known. It was within this narrow compass that certain monks propagated and improved technical instruments. The spread of the hydraulic mill by the Cistercians is well known. Likewise, the many specialized mills to be found at the Abbey of Royaumont, the smith's mill, the fuller's mill, etc. But these exceptions were few. The search for justice before God, the measuring of technique by other criteria than those of technique itself, these were the great obstacles that Christianity opposed to technical progress. They operated in the Middle Ages in all areas of life, and made history coincide with theology. The age of the Reformation, in its effort to return to the most primitive conception of Christianity, broke down many barriers. But even then it was not so much from the influence of the new theology as from the shock of the Renaissance, from humanism and the authoritarian state, that technique received a decisive impetus. The 16th century. In the period from the 16th to the 18th century, the absence of technique in all areas but the mechanical is striking. There was an absence of human reasoning concerning action, of efforts directed toward simplification and systematization, and of concern for efficiency. Certain important technical achievements were made, for example, guns and gun factories, and there was some agricultural research. But it is significant that histories of technique, Pierre Ducasset's, for example, leap from the Middle Ages to the end of the 18th century. Indeed, the period which followed the Renaissance and the Reformation was much less fertile in invention than the period which had preceded them. Printing, the nautical compass, gunpowder, also copied from the East, all date from the 15th century. It would not do to minimize the importance of these inventions. For Norbert Wiener, they constitute the locus of an industrial revolution which preceded the principal industrial revolution. Wiener, in a remarkable way, relates the principal inventions of this period to navigation, which, he proposes, was the propulsive force behind research. Alongside these major inventions, this period also saw a multitude of discoveries and new applications in banking, armaments, machinery, architecture, for example, the discovery of a new system for constructing the dome, as applied to Sainte-Marie-des-Fleurs, and in agriculture and the making of furniture. The 15th century, in addition, is notable for a number of technical manuals from southern Germany and northern Italy, written at the beginning of the century and printed and circulated at the end of it. These show a general interest in these problems, a technical preoccupation on the part of the men of the times. The great voyages were probably a consequence rather than a cause of this technical progress. But this technical drive slackened during the 16th century, which became poorer and poorer in technique, and technical weakness persisted through the 17th century and into the beginning of the 18th. This poverty of technical achievement, which lasted 2 centuries, leads us once more to question the influence of the Reformation. What caused this slowdown of technical progress after the 15th century, which had been so rich in discoveries of all kinds? An uninitiated reader who opens a scientific treatise on law, economy, medicine, or history published between the 16th and the 18th centuries is struck most forcibly by the complete absence of logical order. The materials are treated successively without any connection, progression of thought, development, or show of proof. The reader is apparently to be guided only by the author's fancy. Every chapter in a scientific work, say of the 16th century, is a self-contained unit which justifies and proves itself. A mere affirmation by the author generally serves as proof, and he lets himself go in a free association of ideas which are in no way pertinent to the subject. His thoughts often wend off to matters completely unconnected with the subject of the book. Purely personal reflection and private experience form the foundations of these books. In no sense do they represent an effort at common inquiry, reciprocal control, or search for the best method, all of which are indispensable for technique. The plan of a book was not laid out with the reader in mind. It was not based on subject matter, but rather on the personal fancy of the author, or on more obscure reasonings. Even men of powerful intellect, such as Jean Baudin, did not escape these failings. A second characteristic of this scientific literature is that it attempts to set down in one book the whole realm of knowledge. It is not rare to find, in works on law in the 16th or 17th centuries, extended treatments of archaeology, theology, psychology, and linguistics, not to mention history and literature. Entire chapters concerned with magical practices or Peruvian sociology may interrupt the course of a book devoted to revenues or to the jurisprudence of the Parliament of Bordeaux. This amalgam of reflections and miscellaneous bits of knowledge is found in the works of the best authors. It demonstrates the absence of intellectual specialization. The intellectual ideal was universality, and it was a rare thing for a judge, say, to be ignorant of alchemy or a historian of medicine. This was, in effect, an extension by humanism of the universalism to which medieval theology aspired. In the 16th and 17th centuries, every intellectual had perforce to be a universalist. He had to have complete knowledge, and when he wrote on a given subject, he felt constrained to put into the work everything he knew, pertinent or not. This was by no means a sign of muddle-headedness, but rather of the prevailing search for a synthesized, universal system of knowledge. Every author sought to put his whole self into his work. even in the case of a technical book. Not the subject, but the author dominated the work. This tendency itself is contrary to technical inquiry. The search was not for practical knowledge, but for a comprehensive explication of phenomena. Thus Descartes, after having established an impeccable method of reasoning, gives himself over to the outpourings of his imagination in order to explain, to take a single example, the movements of the tides. This explains another characteristic of the books written after the century of humanism, their lack of convenience. We find few tables of contents, no references, no division into sections, no indices, no chronology, sometimes not even pagination. The apparatus standard for scientific works today is not found even rudimentarily in the most perfect works of the period, and its absence is characteristic of the absence of intellectual technique. The books of the time were not written to be used, along with hundreds of others, to locate a piece of information accurately and quickly, or to validate or invalidate an experiment, or to furnish a formula. They were not written to be consulted. They were written to be read patiently in their entirety and to be meditated upon. Again, this goes back to the ideal of universality. The presentation of a book as an author's entire self, as a personal expression of his very being, supposes that the reader sought in it not the solution of a given difficulty or the answer to a given problem, but rather to make personal contact with the author. It was more a question of a personal exchange than of taking an objective position. This applies to every other field of endeavor until the 18th century. Thus, in the simplest technical form, the mechanical, no decisive progress was made during this time, unless Pascal were to be considered the sole exception. But even Pascal merely extended already known techniques. The same holds true for financial, administrative, and military techniques, in spite of what Vauban says to the contrary. Then an intermediate situation developed. But despite the efforts at coordination and systematization made by such great technicians as Richelieu and Colbert, the only result was a greater complication of the system, without much gain in efficiency. On the administrative and political level, all the new organs, each valuable in itself and without doubt efficient, but representing only an addition to what already existed, had to take into consideration every other organ already functioning in the same field. New complicated departments, jurisdictions, and hierarchies unceasingly weighed down the machinery. On the financial plane, the same monstrous growth occurred, for valid reasons, but it resulted in enfeeblement beneath a seeming efficiency. There was no change in financial technique, in spite of all the efforts of Colbert, who saw what should be done. There was no change in the technique of recruitment, supply, and administration of the army, in spite of the efforts of Louvois, who saw just as clearly what had to be done. Louis XIV was an impotent monarch, despite his authority, because of the absence of technical means. Society was at a crossroads. More and more the need was felt to create new means. Even the structure these must take was clearly perceived. But the framework of society, the ideas in currency, the intellectual positions of the day, were not favorable to their realization. It was necessary to employ technical means in a framework foreign to them. These techniques were powerless to force a decision, or to eliminate outmoded means. They ran up against the profound humanism, issue of Renaissance humanism, which still haunted the 17th century. It believed not only in knowledge and respect for the human being, but in the genuine supremacy of man over means. This humanism, bound up with the idea of universalism, did not allow techniques to grow. Men refused to conform to any uniform law, even when it operated for their own good. This refusal was found in all strata of society, in the most complex way when finance directors and parliamentary councillors refused to utilize new and precise techniques of accounting and legislative supremacy, in the most summary way when the peasants rejected new and rational methods of recruitment proposed for the army. The world had to wait for the 18th century to see technical progress suddenly explode in every country and in every area of human endeavor.